Osbert Guy Stanhope Crawford, better known as O.G.S. Crawford, was a British archaeologist who specialised in the study of prehistoric Britain and the archaeology of Sudan, working for most of his career as the archaeological officer of the Ordnance Survey. He wrote a range of books on archaeological subjects and was a keen proponent of aerial archaeology. Born in Bombay, British India, to a wealthy middle-class Scottish family, Crawford moved to England as an infant and was raised by his aunts in London and Hampshire. He studied geography at Keble College, Oxford, and worked briefly in that field before devoting himself professionally to archaeology. Employed by the philanthropist Henry Wellcome, Crawford oversaw the excavation of Abu Ghili in Sudan before returning to England shortly before the First World War. During the conflict he served in both the London Scottish Regiment and the Royal Flying Corps, where he was involved in both ground and aerial reconnaissance along the Western Front. After an injury forced a period of convalescence in England, he returned to the front, where he was captured by the German army in 1918 and held as a prisoner of war until the end of the conflict, when he returned to Britain. In 1920 he was employed by the Ordnance Survey. In this position he toured Britain to plot the location of archaeological sites in the landscape, in the process identifying a number of previously unknown sites. Increasingly interested in aerial archaeology, he obtained aerial photographs produced by the Royal Air Force and identified the extent of the Stonehenge Avenue, excavating it in 1923. With the archaeologist Alexander Kaler, he conducted an aerial survey of many counties in southern England and raised the finances to secure the land around Stonehenge for the National Trust. In 1927, he established the scholarly journal Antiquity, which contained contributions from many of Britain's most prominent archaeologists, and in 1939 he became president of the Prehistoric Society. An internationalist and socialist, he came under the influence of Marxism and for a time became a Soviet sympathizer. During the Second World War he worked with the National Buildings Record, photographically documenting Southampton. After retiring in 1946, he refocused his attention on Sudanese archaeology and wrote several further books prior to his death. While friends and colleagues remembered Crawford as a cantankerous and irritable individual, his contributions to British archaeology, namely in the form of Antiquity and his promotion of aerial archaeology, have been widely acclaimed, with some referring to him as one of the great pioneering figures in the field. His photographic archive remained of use to archaeologists into the 21st century. A biography of Crawford by Kitty Hauser was published in 2008. Early life. Childhood. O.G.S. Crawford was born on the 28th of October 1886 at Breach Candy, a suburb of Bombay in British India. His father, Charles Edward Gordon Crawford, was a civil servant who had been educated at Marlborough College and Wadham College, Oxford, prior to his move to India, where he became a High Court judge at Thane. A Crawford family hailed from Ayrshire in Scotland, and the child's great-uncle was the politician Robert Wigram Crawford. Crawford's mother, Alice Luscombe Mackenzie, was the daughter of a Scottish Army doctor and his Devonshire wife. Alice died a few days after her son's birth, and when he was 3 months old, Crawford was sent to England aboard the P&M liner Bukhara. During the journey he was entrusted to the care of his paternal aunt Eleanor, an Anglican nun who was the head of the Pune convent of the community of St. Mary the Virgin. After his arrival in Britain, he spent the next 7 years with 2 paternal aunts who lived together near to Portland Place in the Marylebone district of central London. Like his father, they were devout Christians, having been the children of a Scottish clergyman. Under the guardianship, Crawford had little contact with other children or with men. Crawford saw his father on the few occasions that the latter visited England, prior to his death in India in 1894. In 1895, Crawford and his two aunts moved to a rural house in East Woodhay in Hampshire. Initially educated at Park House School, which he enjoyed, he was subsequently moved to Marlborough College, his father's alma mater. He was unhappy there, complaining about bullying and enforced sporting activities, and characterizing it as a detestable house of torture. At the school, Crawford was influenced by his housemaster F.B. Mallim, who presided over the archaeological section of the college's Natural History Society and encouraged the boys' interest in the subject. It has been suggested that Mallim provided something of a father figure for the young Crawford. With the society, Crawford visited such archaeological sites as Stonehenge, West Kennet, Long Barrow, Avebury, and Martinsell. It was also through the society that he obtained Ordnance Survey maps of the landscape, allowing him to explore the downs near to his aunt's home. He began excavation of a barrow near to Bull's Copse, thus attracting the attention of the antiquarian Harold Peake, who was then involved in compiling the Victoria County history of Berkshire. Peake and his wife lived a bohemian lifestyle, being vegetarians and social reformers, and their ideas had strong impact on Crawford. Under the Peake's influence, Crawford rejected his religious upbringing in favor of a rationalist worldview based in science. Moreover, from Peake, Crawford gained an appreciation for the understanding of past societies through an examination of the geographical landscape rather than simply through texts or artifacts. University and early career. 1905 to 1914. Following his schooling, Crawford won a junior scholarship to study at Keble College, Oxford. There he began reading Literae Humanae in 1905, but after gaining only a third-class score in his second-year exams, he switched courses to study geography in 1908. In 1910 he gained a distinction for his diploma, for which he had conducted a study of the landscape surrounding Andover, reflecting his interest in the relationship between geography and archaeology. During a walking tour of Ireland he had also written a paper on the geographic distribution of Bronze Age flat bronze axes and beakers in the British Isles. It was presented to the Oxford University Anthropological Society before being published in the Geographical Journal. The archaeologist Graham Clark later related that the paper marked a milestone in British archaeology. It was the first real attempt to deduce prehistoric events from the geographical distribution of archaeological objects. Crawford's fellow archaeologist Mark Bowden stated that while archaeological distribution maps had been previously produced, archaeological data had never before been married with environmental information in the way that Crawford did in this article. After Crawford graduated, Professor A.J. Herbertson offered him a job as a junior demonstrator in the university's geography department. Crawford agreed, and served in the position, which largely entailed teaching students over the following year. Through Herbertson, Crawford was introduced to Patrick Geddes. Crawford, however, decided that he wanted to focus his attentions on archaeology rather than geography. Attempts to find a professional position in the field were hindered by the fact that very few existed in Britain at the time. Looking elsewhere for archaeological employment, he unsuccessfully applied for a Craven Fellowship and for a post at Bombay Museum, on the recommendation of Herbertson. On 1913, Crawford joined William Scoresby Rutledge and Catherine Rutledge's expedition to Easter Island as an assistant. The expedition was put on with the intent of learning more about the island's first inhabitants and its Moai statues. However, after the team departed from Britain aboard the schooner Mana, Crawford quarreled with the Rutledges, informing them that they exhibited exhibited an extraordinary lack of courtesy and appalling stinginess toward him and other crew members, and he then left the ship at Cape Verde and returned to Britain. He subsequently gained employment from the wealthy philanthropist Henry Wellcome, who sent him to gain training in archaeological excavation from G.A. Reisner in Egypt before sending him on to Sudan, where Crawford was given charge of the excavation of the Meroitic site at Abu Ghili. He remained there from January to June 1914. On his return to England, where he was planning on sorting through the artifacts found in Sudan, he and his friend Ernest Houghton began excavation of a long barrow in Wexcombe Down in Wiltshire. First World War. It was while Crawford was engaged in this excavation that the United Kingdom entered the First World War. At Peake's encouragement, Crawford enlisted to serve in the British Army, joining the London Scottish Regiment, which was sent to reinforce the 1st Battalion in France. The regiment marched to Bethune to relieve the British line. The fighting on the Western Front at Givenchy, afflicted with influenza and malaria in February, Crawford was invalided back to England, being stationed at Birmingham for his recuperation. After recovery, he applied to join the Royal Flying Corps but was deemed too heavy. In July 1915 he was successful in his application to join the Royal Berkshire Regiment as part of the Third Army, being stationed at Beauville and Thent Street, Hull. Utilizing his existing skills, he served as the regiment's maps officer, responsible for mapping the areas around the front line, including the German army positions. He also took various photographs which were used for British propaganda purposes, and in 1916 he guided the writer H.G. Wells around the trenches on the latter's visit to the front. In January 1917, Crawford successfully applied to join the RFC as an observer with the 23rd Squadron, as part of which he flew over enemy lines to make observations and draw maps. On his maiden flight, the German army opened fire on his aircraft, in which his right foot was pierced by bullets and badly injured. To recuperate, he spent time at various hospitals in France and England before eventually being sent to the RFC Auxiliary Hospital at the Halligan Estate in Cornwall. During this time in England he spent a weekend at Wells' home in Dunmow, Essex, embracing the latter's desire for a united world government and the idea that writing about global history was a contribution to that cause. While at Halligan, Crawford began working on a book, Man and His Past, which examined a broad sweep of human history from an archaeological and geographical perspective. In September 1917, Crawford, who had been promoted to the position of Squadron Intelligence Officer, joined the 48th Squadron, during which he again took aerial photographs during flying reconnaissance trips. While on one flight in February 1918, Crawford's aircraft was shot at and forced to land in German-held territory. He and his co-pilot were taken as prisoners of war. He was initially imprisoned at Landshut in Bavaria, from where he tried to escape by swimming down the river Isar. The river current proved too strong and he was soon recaptured. He was then transferred to Holzminden prisoner of war camp, where he was aware of an escape plan involving tunneling out of the camp, but did not take part. Instead, he spent much of his time reading works by Wells, Carl Jung, and Samuel Butler, and working on Man and His Past. Crawford remained in the camp for 7 months, until the declaration of armistice, at which he returned to Britain and was demobilized.